Hello and welcome to the Anishinaabe History Podcast. I'm Chris Waite. Before Canada and before the United States of America existed, Anishinaabe people made treaties with European monarchies. Each nation struggled for control of their share of the North American economy. A lot of modern political discourse, such as land use rights, territorial boundaries, and wars, had their beginnings in this time period. In other words, English kings were largely responsible for modern Canadian treaties and for the birth of the United States of America. From 1727 to 1760, King George II reigned over England. Quote, "Throughout his life, George II maintained a passion for anything military. He displayed courage while fighting the French at the Battle of Dettingen in 1743, the last time a British king appeared on the battlefield. And he organized each day with the precision of a drill sergeant. His other major interest was music. He loved opera and was a patron of the German composer George Friedrich Handel." End quote. King George's War began in 1744 and was the North American theater of the War of Austrian Succession, 1740 to 1748. Quote, "The immediate cause of the war was the death in 1740 of Charles VI, Holy Roman Emperor and ruler of the Austrian Habsburg monarchy. His eldest daughter, Maria Theresa, assumed the throne, but her succession was challenged by France, Prussia, Bavaria, and Spain. Maria Theresa was supported by Britain, Hanover, and the Dutch Republic. The War of the Austrian Succession included the First and Second Silesian Wars in Central Europe and a separate conflict between Britain and Spain, the so-called War of Jenkins' Ear, which began in 1739 and was eventually subsumed by the larger war. The imperial and commercial rivalry between Britain and France played an important role in the war. The two powers struggled for control of North America in what is known as King George's War, 1744 to 48. Britain and France also clashed in India in the First Carnatic War, 1746 to 48. End quote.
The War of Jenkins' Ear was a skirmish over smuggling and piracy in the West Indies. It would spark the much greater conflict called King George's War. It started in 1731, when the Spanish Coast Guard stopped the boat of British merchant Robert Jenkins in the West Indies. The Spanish officers claimed he was trespassing through their waters and proceeded to search his ship. A vicious fight broke out. One of the Spanish agents sliced off Jenkins' ear and told him to present it to the English king. When Jenkins displayed his severed ear to the House of Commons, public opinion turned against Spain. 8 years later, in 1739, England declared war against Spain.
King George's War ended in 1748 with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. Quote, "In May-June 1748, the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle ended the war but settled nothing. Britain returned Louisbourg to France in exchange for Madras, India, which French forces had captured during the war. The Netherlands were ceded to Austria and Silesia to Prussia. The powers were all dissatisfied with their respective allies and so made changes. On the eve of the 7 Years' War, Prussia was allied with Britain, while Austria was allied with France." End quote.
On December 6, 1749, in London, King George II formally approved a massive land grant of 200,000 acres along the upper Ohio River to the Ohio Company of Virginia, with the option to claim another 300,000 acres if they settled 100 families within 7 years. The company had been founded the previous year by prominent Virginians. Their goal was to open a profitable western trade route, sell land to settlers, and counter French expansion in the Ohio Valley. By 1750, the company was building storehouses and sending surveyors, including a teenage George Washington in 1748 and again in 1750. French forces responded aggressively, capturing company traders and eventually building a chain of forts. These clashes helped ignite the French and Indian War in 1754.
In 1754, the so-called French and Indian War officially began. It is also known as the 7 Years' War. The Britannica Encyclopedia has a start year of 1756. The Canadian Encyclopedia states that the French had been building forts in 1753. What is important to remember is that by the mid-1700s, England and France had both laid claim to the Ohio River Valley, and both France and England were allies with many other nations back in Europe. Quote, "The 7 Years' War pitted the alliance of Britain, Prussia, and Hanover against the alliance of France, Austria, Sweden, Saxony, Russia, and eventually Spain. The war was driven by the commercial and imperial rivalry between Britain and France, and by the antagonism between Prussia, allied to Britain, and Austria, allied to France. In Europe, Britain sent troops to help its ally, Prussia, and was surrounded by its enemies. However, the main British war aim was to destroy France as a commercial rival, and they therefore focused on attacking the French navy and colonies overseas. France was committed to fighting in Europe to defend its ally, Austria. It therefore had few resources to spare for its colonies." End quote. In 1758, the British defeated the French at Fort Frontenac. In that same year, France lost some of its North American allies. Quote, "France's indigenous allies in the Ohio region made a separate peace with the British, forcing the French to abandon Fort Duquesne." End quote. The next year, England beat France at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. These losses led to the surrender of Quebec to England in September of 1759. Another year later, and the French surrendered Montreal. In 1760, King George II died, and a new king now sat upon the throne of England, King George III. Quote, "Despite military and naval victories, the British were staggering under a colossal national debt by 1760. The War Minister, William Pitt, urged the government to declare war on Spain, which made a defensive alliance with France in August 1761. But the new king, George III, wanted peace. By the end of the year, Pitt had been driven out of office. The war would not end, however, until 1763. Britain declared war on Spain in January 1762 and continued its operations overseas. In February and March 1762, the British took Martinique, St. Lucia, Grenada, and St. Vincent. They captured Havana from the Spanish in August, followed by Manila in October 1762. End quote. The Peace of Paris, 1763, brought the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War, to an end. Quote, "Meanwhile, the governments of Britain, France, and Spain were negotiating peace terms. The first minister of the French government, the Duc de Choiseul, was determined to regain the valuable sugar colonies of Martinique and Guadeloupe, and to keep a base for the Grand Banks fisheries. He also wanted Cape Breton, but had to settle for the tiny islands of Saint Pierre and Miquelon as a fishing station. Britain agreed to return Martinique and Guadeloupe to France, but secured the West Indian islands of Dominica, Tobago, St. Vincent, and Grenada. Spain surrendered Florida to the British, but received part of France's vast Louisiana territory. France also left New France to Britain, as it was less valuable commercially than either the sugar islands of the West Indies or the fishing islands of the North Atlantic. The size and location of New France also made it an expensive colony to defend and maintain. In addition, Choiseul was convinced that the American colonies, which no longer needed British military protection, would soon strike out for independence. 12 years later, the American colonies rose in revolt against Britain. Ironically, it was only with the military aid of the French that they finally gained their independence. End quote. The year 1763 is also important in terms of Indigenous rights in modern Canada. 1763 is the year that King George II of England made his royal proclamation concerning the land and people of North America. He couldn't have made such a proclamation if he had lost the war. Modern Canada was shaped by that war. Quote, "The 7 Years' War was a crucial turning point in Canadian history. With the Treaty of Paris in 1763, France formally ceded New France to the British and largely withdrew from the continent. The 7 Years' War therefore laid the bicultural foundations of modern Canada. However, the removal of France as a North American power gave Anglo-American colonists greater confidence, as they no longer needed the protection of the British military. This led indirectly to the outbreak of the American Revolution in 1775, which would further influence Canadian identity and boundaries, including the influx of Loyalists and the creation of Upper Canada and New Brunswick. The war also changed the relationship between Britain and Indigenous peoples living in what would become Canada. In the spring of 1763, an Indigenous confederacy under Odawa chief Pontiac seized British military posts in the Great Lakes area. Many First Nations had allied with France during the war and protested American settlement and British policies under Jeffrey Amherst. The British government wanted to secure their allegiance and loyalty and stabilize the western frontier. It therefore issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which created a vast Indigenous reserve west of the Appalachian Mountains. In addition, it stated explicitly that Indigenous people reserved all lands not ceded by or purchased from them. The proclamation also included policies meant to assimilate the French population to British rule. These were later replaced by the Quebec Act, 1774. End quote. Among the declarations within the Royal Proclamation of 1763 is land to be granted to men who served in the British military during the war. Field officers were to receive 5,000 acres, while a private received 50 acres. The ranks in between likewise received various amounts of land according to rank. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 made stipulations regarding Indigenous people and their land. The proclamation states, quote, "And whereas it is just and reasonable, and essential to our interest in the security of our colonies, that the several nations or tribes of Indians with whom we are connected and who live under our protection should not be molested or disturbed in the possession of such parts of our dominions and territories as, not having been ceded to or purchased by us, are reserved to them or any of them as their hunting grounds. We do therefore, with the advice of our Privy Council, declare it to be our royal will and pleasure that no governor or commander-in-chief in any of our colonies of Quebec, East Florida, or West Florida do presume, upon any pretense whatever, to grant warrants of survey or pass any patents for lands beyond the bounds of their respective governments, as described in their commissions, as also that no governor or commander-in-chief in any of our other colonies or plantations in America do presume for the present, and until our further pleasure be known, to grant warrants of survey or pass patents for any lands beyond the heads or sources of any of the rivers which fall into the Atlantic Ocean from the west and northwest, or upon any lands whatever, which, not having been ceded to or purchased by us as aforesaid, are reserved to the said Indians, or any of them." End quote. Partly because of this stipulation, 13 British colonies would unite and rebel against England a decade later. After that war, the War for American Independence, the United States and England would agree to the Anglo-American Convention in 1818. This agreement established the 49th parallel as the international border and claimed Oregon Territory as jointly occupied by both England and the United States. After the Convention of 1818, the Americans and the English would make their way westwards. Hundreds of treaties were signed across Turtle Island. Only when the Canadian and American railroads made it to the west coast did the treaty-making process end. Even with the treaties, millions of indigenous people were killed by colonization. For example, conflicts such as the Dakota War began after a treaty was signed and after the American Union recognized Minnesota as a state. Another example is the residential school system. Children were forced to attend those schools after treaties were signed, and yet at those schools, thousands of children died, and not by accident. It is important to understand that modern treaties are predicated upon earlier treaties. The mere fact that treaties were signed at all indicates that European nations recognized that indigenous tribes were nations unto themselves. Most of the treaties of Turtle Island state the names of tribal nations across a multitude of regions. Therefore, treaties are not just legal writing, they are geographic recognition of indigenous populations. That's all for today's episode. Stay tuned for more episodes in the future. I'm Chris Waite, and this has been the Anishinaabe History Podcast.